Hi everyone, and welcome to our short 10 to 15-minute video on Unit 514, Managing Change. I'm going to hand over to our tutor James, who's going to take you through the assignment. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Charlotte. Hello, everybody. So, yeah, here we have three questions to fill in, or three learning outcomes to fill in with various topics to cover within them. I'll talk you through it just next and see if we can help you a little bit with completion of this assignment. Let's get straight into it then. So, we're going to look at how we do change in theory, but also we're going to ask you to produce an actual plan for your organization to do change. So all the stuff we're going to talk about in the first couple of questions lead on to you producing your own kind of proposed plan for change in your own organizations. So just bear that in mind as we go through. First, learning outcome then is to understand the reasons for change in organizations, what drives it. We have three questions to start us off with. Firstly, analyze the environmental factors which influence change in organizations. As we go through this, we often say or advise delegates to apply three different rules to how they write their responses. Firstly, to define any key terms in the questions clearly. Secondly, to make sure we meet the command verb, which is the first word or two in the question. And thirdly, to use less is more. So only as many different arguments or theories as you need to do to answer the question and no more than that. So we're going to try and apply those rules as we go through to illustrate what we mean. And we're going to do that here as well. So the first thing I would do here is to define what we mean by change. It sounds like a really obvious thing, but the whole assignment's based on this idea of change. What do we mean by that? How is change the same or different from transformation? And what kinds of different change might we see? We might look at individual, we might look at team, full structural organization. There could be technological change, behavioral change. What the different types of change we're actually talking about in organizations when we mention change. Some definition of what we mean by organizational change, I think, could be quite useful. We're then going to go into analyzing those environmental factors that influence change in organizations here. I mean, the obvious thing here would be to look at a pest type structure. So political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal you could add onto there as well. And there are a couple of models you could bring in for this. One is the PEST, the standard PEST or PESTEL model. But you could potentially look at Porter's 5 forces as well for this to look at the external kind of impacts of competition some more as well. Either or is absolutely fine. But you're asked here to analyze those environmental factors, everything outside the organization that drives change within it. And so let's go to our command verb definitions. To analyze, we're asked to break it into separate parts and examine each part in detail, identifying the main issues and showing how the main ideas are related to practice and why they are important. And again, reference to any current research or theory could support that. So we're going to analyze those factors that could influence change in organizations. So you might pick them apart and say, okay, this is the real, one of the big drivers for organizations. This is an important one. This one's variable and changes and hard to pin down. This is an emerging influence for change in organizations you could perhaps analyze as well. So I think just laying out your stall on what the key terms of change really mean, and then laying out some model or theory around what environmental factors could be, analyzing those factors. So listing them isn't enough. It's not enough to say, right, they could be political, economic, social. We need to analyze the factors in more detail than that. And if you wanted to make this kind of contextual to organizations, you could actually look at your own organizational context and bring out a few of the key factors that might be influencing change in your organization as well, to bring it to life a little bit and illustrate and support that analysis a little bit further. 1.2 is to analyze the internal factors that drive the need for change in organizations. So here, this could be, performance metrics. It could be a drive to make more profit or reduce costs, for example. It could be to do with governance and improving governance around the place, reducing risk or remanaging risks in some way. It could be that we're struggling to staff our services or departments up to the right levels in terms of people. That might drive us to go to technological solutions for that, to bridge the gap, for example. So a good way to do this might be to consider what kind of intrinsic strengths and weaknesses an organization might have and how that might then drive the need for change here. Okay. And again, you might want to bring this to life by using your own organization as an exemplar for this to analyze a little bit what those internal factors that you see driving the need for change around where you are, just to, again, bring that to life. 1.3 is to examine the potential impact of change in organizations. There's an assumption here in the indicative content that those impacts are positive. I'm not sure that's true. You might decide that actually some of the potential impacts of change can be negative. If they're ill-conceived changes done clumsily, attempts fail. Actually, we know that most organizations do fail or stumble in their attempts to change. There's a lot to talk about here in potential impacts of change in organizations, I think. What we're looking to do here, there's nothing particularly to define here if you've already defined change, but we do need to think about what those impacts might be here in some detail. I'm going to examine them is the command verb, just to really make this clear. Examine then is to inspect something thoroughly in order to determine its nature or condition. So again, we need more than a list of what the impacts might be. We're going to really dig into those, what those real impacts, how might we see them, to what extent are they impactful, positive and negative. So yeah, okay, you might assume that generally when we're trying to change something it's for a good reason somehow, but there might be some negative impacts of change as well you could think about, you could include here as well, just to perform that examination in a bit more detail as well. Indicative content could be we want to achieve objectives better, improve efficiency or quality, change or shift the culture in some way, improve performance systems and processes, adopt or change technology in some ways. It could be that we achieve better engagement through the changes that we make. It may be that we position ourselves more competitively in a competitive or comparable type marketplace as a result of our change as well. It could be we're more, through the change, more attractive to future staff or investors or sponsors, that kind of thing. So quite a bit to talk about with the first learning outcome. Let's move on to learning outcome 2. We're going to understand approaches to change management analysis. What tools might we use and approaches might we take to do change once we've kind of figured out what we mean by it? 2.1, evaluate the use of theoretical models for managing change. This is fairly straightforward, actually. There's nothing really to define here because you've already defined change. What we're going to ask you to do is select between 2 and 4 different specific models on how we manage change, whichever you think are most interesting or the ones you're more familiar with or the ones you were taught on your courses, and you're going to evaluate the use of each of them separately. So this would lend itself to kind of paragraph structure. Theoretical model number 1, this is your evaluation of its use. Theoretical model number 2, this is your evaluation of the use of that one. There's lots of different change modeling uses, different models you could think of here. They're listed in indicative content here. Just some that you might use that aren't enlisted here as well. It doesn't really matter what you use, as long as you use something that's fairly relevant for you, that's supported by some research or academic background, ideally. I tend to use Kotter's 8 steps pretty frequently. But again, as long as you're using theoretical models and more than one and evaluating how they're used, to evaluate, what's really important to evaluate is that you consider the strengths and weaknesses of the models and their use, arguments for and against them, how the models themselves might be similar and different overall as well. You might talk about that and look at different perspectives on the use of the models to form a reasoned judgment or conclusion on them. So in your view, this question is asking you, what do you think about the use of these theoretical models for managing change? How effective, useful, important are they? What resources are required? What works well? What might not work so well? That's the kind of thing you need to bring here, not just a list and explanation of the models, but your evaluation of the use of them. 2.2, then analyze the role of leadership in gaining the commitment of others to change. So here it might be, again, indicative content. You could talk around role modeling, communications, clarity of why we're doing the change in the first place. In a lot of the models you'll have looked at in 2.1, there's a role in leadership bedded into that in terms of gathering stakeholders together, or in terms of communicating a common vision for the thing, in terms of making sure the whole thing stacks up consistently over time. So what does leadership need to do to gain commitment from the whole population of stakeholders for change? Again, you might think if it helps about what leaders need not to do to make sure change works well, but you have to analyze the role of leadership here. So again, the analysis here, just to be really clear, is to make sure you've broken it down into separate parts and examined it in detail and looked at how leadership practice in this case relates into change in the organization specifically. So that's the analysis, not just a list of different things, but to analyze the role of leadership in getting that commitment for others for change. 2.3, specify reasons for engaging with stakeholders throughout the change management process. Again, there's quite a bit going on with this one, actually. The first thing I would recommend you might do here is to define what we mean by stakeholders. Who are they? What might be a typical type of stakeholder around a typical organization or around your organization, in fact? So what do we mean by stakeholders? What are examples of stakeholders? And again, you might want to use your own environment to illustrate this point. Throughout the change management process, you might break that down to beginning, middle, and end. That's a process. And depending on maybe some of the models and theories that you've looked at in 2.1. And then you're going to try and specify the reasons for engaging with stakeholders throughout that process. So it could be to establish the need for change in the first place. It could be to gather commonality and commitment to the change from different stakeholders early on. It could be that we want to make sure that all our stakeholders are reporting back on progress and challenges and collaborations and shared best practice throughout the change. And at the end, it could be towards the end of the process that it's important we engage with stakeholders to demonstrate that we've been successful and met needs. Identify kind of who the kind of stakeholders around a change could be, and then thinking around for each of them then what might be the reasons for engaging with them throughout that process. Again, you might think about beginning, middle, and end here. So it's not, again, we're not just listing different stakeholders, we're trying to specify the reasons for engaging with them throughout the process. And it might help you as well to think a little bit here around what happens if we don't engage with stakeholders throughout the process. Learning outcome 3, this is basically you now developing your own change management plan in your own organizational context here. And it's broken down. It looks quite intimidating because 8 different questions here, but it's basically breaking down that process into the different component parts. Let's run through it. 3.1 is to specify the rationale for initiating change within an organization. So this is where we might be looking at what the benefits might be, the business case, maybe some consequences and risks for the change as well. But what might be the need for starting change in your organization? You might think about a particular point, it could be poor performance, it could be technological change, anything we've discovered in the past from before, or the strengths and weaknesses we've looked at in the first learning outcome. How does that apply to your organization? What's topical for you right now? It'll be good here to actually put together a business case for why you think a change would be beneficial overall in your own organization here. That's 3.1. So again, just to specify, if we look at the command verb, it's identify state of fact or requirement clearly and precisely in detail. So production of a business case here with consequences and risks identified would be good. Once you've got that, 3.2 is to develop a plan for change within an organization. So what objectives might you have? Milestones might we set out? What resources might be required? Deadlines, responsibilities, all that kind of stuff. There are some models you might bring into play here, including force field analysis from Lewin, or ADCAR, another one that could be used here, for example, as a model to kind of develop that plan for change. What would it look like where you are? Develop means to take from a starting point onwards. So the kind of starting point is kind of almost given to you by 3.1, 3.2. From that rationale for initiating change, then what would your plan be? 3.3 is examine tools for implementing and monitoring change. So this could be process maps, Gantt charts, communication, project plans, the project management stuff of it, I guess. How do we implement the change? How do we monitor its effectiveness? We're asked here to look at tools. So I'd, again, advise you to select 2, maybe 3 specific different tools that do the job of implementing and monitoring change throughout. And then you're going to, for each of them, examine and pick them apart in some detail. Not just list them, but actually pick the tools apart. What might we need to make them work? What might be some of the benefits of those tools in particular? And some of the challenges around them too, maybe. What would make the tools work very well? What might stop them working well? 3.4, recommend approaches to overcome risks and barriers to change. So we identify what the risks and barriers are. Some of that stuff, again, could come in 3.1 in your business case for it. But then given those particular risks and barriers to the change, what do you recommend you might do to try and overcome them, again, probably in your own context, in your own organization? 3.5, develop strategies for communicating plan change to stakeholders. Again, you might want to bring a tool in here or modeling in here. So Mendeley matrix springs to mind as one particular example you might use. So you've got a change in mind. You're looking at how to plan that out, look at some of the barriers. Now you're going to look at how you're going to communicate that change to stakeholders. And you're asked to look at a couple of different ways that you might do that. So I think it's a case of, okay, this group of stakeholders, what's going to work with them? That group of stakeholders, what might work better with them? And make sure that you've got some feedback on how effective that communication is over some time, and that you're trying to get that nice engagement throughout the piece. 3.6, assess practical methods to support individuals through the change management process. Again, the process could be beginning, middle, and end, so all those different areas throughout the process. And we're looking at practical methods that might support individuals through the change management process. So again, as it says in indicative content here, you kind of obvious stuff here might include coaching and mentoring, also general learning development, training, supervision, special advice and support. That kind of thing would be worthwhile considering here in 3.6. And you're going to look at identifying, again, maybe 2, 3, at most 4 different types of practical method that might support individuals through change, and they're going to assess each of them. So again, what's required to make that thing work? What undermines it? What overall do you think are the most effective ways to support people through change in your particular context, and why? These are all good things that perform part of that assessment of the different methods. 3.7, Analyze methods for monitoring and measuring the impact of plan change. So this is kind of you set your kind of stall out for the benchmarks and gateways and deliverables from the beginning. Now, how are you going to intend to monitor and measure those impacts of the change? Again, you might look at periodic reporting, questionnaires, surveys, interviews, mystery shopper scorecards. What kind of data and metrics might you want to capture throughout? You can lean into one of your change methods here in terms of if the change is working, we might want to behave in a different way. That means that by 6 months in, everybody needs to be trained on the new technology, and you can measure that. That might be then a legitimate part of your rollout. One way you might think around this is again to bring a model in such as Kirkpatrick, 4 levels of evaluation is one. You don't have to use that, but it's an example of what might help to identify, measure, and management and monitoring of the impact of the change as you go through. And finally, 3.8, discuss approaches to embed and sustain the plan change in an organization. Again, sounds like John Cotter and stages 7 and 8 to embed and sustain the change. How do we make it stick? How to make the change land? You're looking here to try and look at more than one different approach to doing that job. 2 approaches, 3 approaches maximum here. Identify different approaches specifically. Again, you might look at continuous professional improvement. You might look at changing the way you recruit, promote, train, onboard, monitor, all that kind of thing might come into play here. Okay, but you're going to look at more than one approach, but not more than 3, and discuss each of them. Discussion means to look at different perspectives on those approaches, to be a little bit critical around them, what the pros and cons of each approach, and what might be the implications of different approaches be. And that should form a nice kind of real world example of what a change plan can look like for you in your own context, just to demonstrate that you've kind of able to really apply the theory into practice.
Thank you very much, James. We hope that you found this helpful. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me on cmi@impd.co.uk, and we look forward to receiving your assignments soon. Thanks, everyone.